Well, good morning, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 2, and McDuff Lives 2 is our backup channel for McDuff Lives. McDuff Lives will be back up, I believe, tomorrow. They gave me a 1-week strike, so I should be back up there tomorrow. But for today, we're here on the backup channel and also broadcasting simultaneously on Eek Eek Airwaves, the channel sponsored and run by Neighborhood News Studio, all courtesy of Andy DeBala, our great producer. And so here we go with another Tuesday morning with Harley, and Harley Schlanger's here. How are you, Harley?
I'm doing pretty well, all things considered.
Okay, good answer. All things considered, indeed. Well, I think what we're here for is to maybe consider some of those things that could be improved.
Well, life comes at you, and if you're not always ready for things, but got to land on your feet and look for the best.
All right. Well, I think that's good advice. And yeah, sometimes we feel like we haven't found where the floor yet. Where can we land? I want to stop this falling. But,
you feel like you're tumbling and you don't know which direction, but as they say, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm making good time.
Okay. Well, I like advancing slowly on a broad front. How about that?
That's a good one.
All right. Well, let's advance as far as we can this morning with the issues that we're facing here. You had a very important conference this weekend in which you invited me to submit a question, and I did submit the question, but I wasn't aware that it ever got asked. And you explained that to me right before the show. I think that people would be interested in hearing the question and your recollection of what. I'm sorry, I'll butcher his name, but the doctor that the Russian gentleman that gave the answer. If you could just summarize that exchange,
Sure.
That'd be a good place to start.
Well, I combined two questions. Your question was, are the Russians concerned that the United States is becoming a totalitarian state? That was your question. So I just added, given the demonization of Russia with Russiagate, all the attacks on Putin, the blaming of Russia for hacking and everything else, and then the reaction to that, the censorship in the United States, the polarization. Are you concerned that the United States is becoming a totalitarian state? And the speaker was Dr. Andrei Kortunov, who's the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, which is run by Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov is the honorary chairman. Andrei runs the think tank day to day. He's a historian, a scholar, and he gave a very fascinating picture of what he's thinking after the summit. And so when I gave him this question, he reflected back on that. He said, look, we don't really have much control over what happens in the United States, but many countries have tendencies to go up and down. It depends on a lot of questions, a lot of developments that happen. And we have to, when we look at the United States, we have to look at the fact in the long arc of history, the United States has generally been stable. It's generally been a force for good, but it has gone into these periods where you wonder what's happening. And so he said, I myself am more optimistic about the future of the United States than many of my American friends. And that really struck me because generally he's somewhat pessimistic. But later he said something very interesting. He mentioned that he had just had a conversation with Sergei Lavrov. This wasn't in terms of your question, John, but he said that Lavrov was very worried about the fact that the relations had gotten so bad at the end of the Trump era, largely due to Pompeo, sanctions, and so on. And now Lavrov is saying that we're seeing a tendency in the United States to assume that it's the world's policeman and that it can dictate terms to every other nation. And he said, that's just not acceptable, not just for Russia, not just for China, but for many, many smaller nations that are trying to find their own pathway to development. And I think this is important because yesterday I was interviewed by Iranian Press TV after the Putin-Xi summit, and where they signed a new friendship treaty. And the question from the Iranian host was, is the Russian-China friendship a reaction to U.S. attacks on Russia and China. And I said, well, actually, it goes back before that. It's an economic agreement initially to work together for mutual benefit. But given the attacks on it from the West, it can function as a military alliance. And so I incorporated some of what Dr. Kortunov had said on Saturday in the answer I gave. And, I think if you look at what's happening now, it's a very scary moment. We nearly had war on June 23rd when the British gunboat diplomacy sent the HMS Defender into Russian territorial waters. And the Russians scrambled, they warned it, they sent out radio warnings, got no response. So then they shot some shots across the bow, they dropped some bombs in front of it to cause it to turn, and it eventually turned. So the British Foreign Office said, oh, there were no shots fired, there was nothing that happened. It was just a peaceful passage through the Black Sea. But they didn't know there was a BBC reporter on board who had already reported that there were shots and there were bombs dropped. So then Boris Johnson said, well, we don't accept Russia's ownership of the waters off Ukraine. And now what we found out, and this is, John, this is, given your interest in spookery, I think you find this very fascinating. They found several days later a packet of classified documents at a bus stop in Kent, Ministry of Defense classified documents, talking about the HMS Defender, and they were going to try and provoke a Russian response. Now, when Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, was asked about this, she sort of joked and she said, well, I don't know why you need Russian hackers as long as there are bus stops. But it's clear the British intended to provoke a response. The Russians responded, and the Russians said, next time you do it, we're not going to shoot over the bow, we're going to shoot at the boat. Now, why are the British doing this? Because they're completely destabilized by the fact that Biden and Putin at least agreed to talk. I don't know what's going to come of this Geneva summit, but they agreed to talk about strategic matters in a serious way. And that went against the plan, which was to have Biden confront Putin, Putin respond in a macho manner, and then end the summit. But they reaffirmed a statement from the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in 1985, which is extremely important. And it basically had the sentence, no one can win a nuclear war, and one should never be fought. And including that was important because when Reagan and Gorbachev made that affirmation, many people say that the peaceful resolution of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was based on that statement included in the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Geneva in 1985. So we have a bit of a breathing space here with Russia-US relations. And so what happens? The Brits send a gunboat into Crimea to try and provoke something. And I can tell you more about this because this goes back to what happened in 1853 to 56, the Crimean War. The U.S. response should be what Eisenhower did in 1956 when the Brits invaded the Suez Canal, tried to move in on the Suez Canal after Nasser nationalized it. And the Brits, the French, and the Israeli armies crossed into the Suez, and they called on the U.S. to join them. And Eisenhower said, get the hell out or we're going to dump British pound sterling notes. And the Brits turned tail and ran. So I think that there's one final note, John, that there's in this sort of opening monologue. The top 6 British defense officials, including the Chief of Staff and the Minister of Defense, are now under quarantine because the Chief of Staff was tested positive for COVID. So I said in my update today, maybe this is divine justice, that these 6 guys were meeting to plan this HMS Defender stunt, and now they're all in quarantine. Let's go one step further. Let's quarantine the British Empire. So that's sort of my summary of the strategic situation, if you will.
Well, you sound like John Paul Jones. I mean, let's get some privateers and go sail around all the ports of Great Britain and tell them that they're all shut down because of the intolerable actions of their government. And when their government changes, we'll let them do business again. That's the old John Paul Jones approach. Yeah.
And what's wrong with that? I mean, if we are the superpower, if the United States is the superpower, why are we letting the British drag us into wars?
Exactly. Exactly. And if we're free, why, if we're still free, I mean, we have July 4th coming up this weekend, a Declaration of Independence. A declaration of what? Could you repeat that last word again? What was that word?
Well, even the first word,
what is that?
declaration.
Independence means that we don't do what they tell us to do anymore, right? And that the way
And we declare this, and we're going to back it up with our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That's in the Declaration.
Perfectly. And that was the spirit of it. And it was like we've had enough. We don't want any more British control. But now we've been studying that. You and I and many people have. How has this happened? And it always comes around to the formation of NATO and the Atlantic Council and the combination of interests of the old money of the old elite families in America and the oligarchical families that rule behind the scenes in Great Britain, and how they are all dependent upon one another and consider each other to be basically the same group of elite people that God chose to lead the world. So it's not a mystery. It's just that very few people are aware of it.
And John, I brought up the Eisenhower example in '56 because here was a case of a general who commanded the Allied troops in World War II, who came forward at a moment of potential total chaos in the world. I mean, that period in 1956, besides the Suez Crisis, you also had the Soviet tanks go into Budapest. And the question was, would the US respond to that or not? So what Eisenhower sent a very important signal: we're not intervening in other nations' affairs. So if the Soviet Union intervenes in Hungary, we're not going to go to war with them over that, but we don't agree with that. And we're not going to intervene in the affairs of Egypt when Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. And the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was pleading with Eisenhower. And Eisenhower said, look, there are all these reasons why we shouldn't do it, but let me tell you something. If you don't get out, we're going to make you pay a price. We're going to dump the British pound sterling bonds, which would have probably collapsed the British financial system at that point. So the Brits had to back down. Now, the important follow-up to that, you have Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech as he's going out the door. What's he talking about? The military that would have gone along with the British into the Suez, would have tied us up in these wars. He said, no, we're not going to do it. Then Kennedy comes in. And they're all, I was looking for pictures today of Kennedy and Eisenhower together. There were all these pictures of them. They had a bunch of meetings. They talked together. They were at Camp David. And then we see Kennedy, who's avowedly anti-colonial, moving against what is the British imperial interests as president, especially against the Federal Reserve, and he's killed. There's one of those photos, exactly. And what happens after this? Who is the last president who stood up to the British? There hasn't been one. Trump should have, because he knew the British were involved in the operations against him. And he let some things come out on Christopher Steele. But the whole apparatus from GCHQ, MI6 to the City of London was behind the Russiagate story. And at the end of Trump's term, what was he doing? He was going along with the sanctions against Russia, sanctions against China, the Caesar sanctions that are killing children in Syria. So we've had this history since the assassination of Kennedy of not standing up to the British. And if we don't change that, we may not be able to celebrate our Declaration of Independence that much longer.
Sorry. It makes me think it would have been merciful if Eisenhower had pulled the plug on the British pound back in 1956, and all of this would have been done. We'd be past that by now, and Britain
Yeah.
would have realized that it's trying to play way above it's trying to fight above its weight, which is what it's doing. It has been doing for a long time, based upon its control of finances and control of people within the United States government. This has been going on since before World War II.
Yeah.
The more I read, do you know the book called Trading with the Enemy by
Sure.
I'm just now maybe a third of the way through that book, and it lays it out right there. I mean,
it's about the corporate cartels and the way they worked during World War II.
Mm-hmm. And
before World War II.
Well, there was a similar point involving Standard Oil's president or chairman, whether it was Farish or Teagle. I can't remember at the moment, but I think it was Farish. But the part of the book that I'm referring to is a quote that says that Harold Ickes, Ickes, and others, and also let's give credit to J. Edgar Hoover, were reporting to Roosevelt, and another guy, Burrell. These guys were reporting to Roosevelt, hey,
Adolf Burrell,
their Standard Oil is doing business with the Nazis. They're running it through Mexico or Argentina or the Canary Islands, but they're doing it, and the frustrating thing for Ickes was that he didn't know that Roosevelt was, kind of double dealing and saying, okay, well, we're going to let these guys get away with it to some extent because we need them. And the clincher at the end of the paragraph was that Ickes just did not realize that the United States needed Standard Oil in order to fight the war.
But this was that same Trading with the Enemy Act was used against the Union Bank Corporation of New York, which was the Harriman Bank that included Prescott Bush as its American board of directors, which was working with German banks to fund Hitler. So it wasn't even just funding German companies that were part of a cartel. The cartel arrangements were set up in the 1920s. We talked about this before, out of the same offices where George Shultz's father worked. Burl Earl Schultz worked at 120 Broadway, where you had these companies that were part of what was called the Trust. And one group of them were funding companies in Germany with the Nazis. Another side of that included people like Armand Hammer, who were building up the Soviets. So you had these two groups of Wall Street interests on different sides of the room, working with the two major totalitarian powers in the world.
And it's astonishing. And that this is, the United States wasn't free then because they needed Standard Oil. And look at it this way, though. Suppose that Walter Teagle, in that position, had said to himself, you know what? If we don't give oil to Nazi Germany, they can't fight the war. And if we don't give oil to the United States, they can't fight the war. So why don't we just declare peace? Let's just say, hey, you guys go ahead, beat yourselves up with clubs, but you're not using our oil to destroy the world. They had an opportunity there to have applied pressure in the name of peace. And it tells you right off that they're not interested in peace. They're interested in money.
Mm-hmm. And that was made clear in the book. I think it's Higham wrote the book, right?
Yeah, Charles Higham, Higham. Thanks for reminding me in case people want to look it up. In the 80s, the book was published, and I hadn't really run across it until a week or so ago. And I said, wow,
I have an old beat up copy behind me somewhere, but that was an important book when it came out, and it got almost no play. Some of these stories about the corporate cartels, if you really dig in, what you find is that corporatism grew out of something from the period in the 1890s in France, but really became a force with Mussolini, who called his corporatist socialism became fascism. And it was the idea that the oligarchy, which controls finance, can control the government. And isn't that what we're facing today? A corporate oligarchy, which is dictating the terms to our elected officials. They're integrated into the banking system is one integrated cartel. And the Great Reset is the plan they have for this cartel to completely take over the function of government that's supposed to be exclusively government, which is spending policy, fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve has, and I think unconstitutionally, been given the mandate to control monetary policy. And look at the mess they've made of it. But they're now claiming that the solution to the present economic global crisis is to have central banks make fiscal policy, spending policy as well, take it out of the hands of elected governments, which sometimes, quote, mistakenly take the side of their constituents as opposed to protecting the banks and the financial system. So that's what we're dealing with. It's on a global scale. And I would simply add that the hostility toward Russia and China, and look, do I agree with everything Putin and Xi do? No, I'm more so I agree with Putin. But they're standing up for their national sovereignty. And this is something that we need to do in the United States. If the United States joined with Russia and China and India and a few other countries as sovereign nations and asserted their power over and above the globalist financial cartels, the raw material cartels, the food cartels, the pharma cartels, and so on, if they asserted national interests, they could come up with a way of working for mutual benefit between them. And that's what we were talking about primarily at our Schiller Institute conference this last weekend. How do we reach that higher coincidence of opposites, where countries with different approaches, different cultures, different ways of looking at the world, nevertheless can find solutions that benefit all parties? And that's what statecraft should be, not who has the bigger gunboat and the ability to control the media and the lies better.
I think Lyndon LaRouche was and is at the vanguard of a movement that really needs to have a lot more behind it, which is the idea that there isn't any scarcity. There's no real scarcity, and that what we really need to do is to have more people, and with more ideas, with more education, with more technical skills that are going to solve more problems. Because as we increase our population, and even the Bible says, go forth and multiply. Yeah. We're doing God's will. And if we do that, and the creatures that God has created here, these humans have these amazing minds, and boy, I know some really smart people that can solve these problems, then what's missing here is simply an attitude of, hey, let's move forward. Let's be great. Let's be bigger than what we are. Let's be better than what we are. Let's go to Mars. Let's go to the asteroids. Let's mine the moon. Let's take care of our health problems at home. Let's solve the poverty problems. All these things are doable and viable under the idea that life is a good thing and life goes forward, and life is kind of a what was the word? Was it fractal or something? And anyway, it increases in ways that we can't see, because mathematically it grows and grows and grows and grows. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of room on this planet for everybody that's here now, and twice that many or 10 times that many. That it's not a matter of not having enough real estate. It's not a matter of not having enough food. It's a matter of having a zero-sum game attitude, where if I don't get it, you will. And so it's my job to take it away from you. And that is the British attitude. That is what causes people who, and look at the way the United States is founded. You look at people that are fleeing from that monarchy, that empire. that come here to try to set up something brand new. And, they may have succeeded, except for the empire said, well, no, you're not. We're going to come right behind you, and we're going to take over all the governments, and we're going to make sure that our already wealthy friends get the first fruits of the discoveries and the best pieces of land. That imperial attitude has been pressing on us since the very beginning of this country, at least the beginning of it as a Western nation. And that imperial attitude is exactly what we're facing now in so many ways. The World Economic Forum seems to be nothing but a forum for the already elite to find more ways to squeeze us and more ways to enrich themselves at our expense. Life should not be a zero-sum game. It was not described that way by the church. It was never described that way by historians. And we're facing here what is an artificial scarcity in so many ways. Just the scarcity that has been caused by the empire, so that they could skim more and reduce us to serfs. And why can't people see that? Why can't Americans see that? Well, I guess it's all about Freud and Bernays and mass media propaganda. Is my answer. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, it's a philosophical question at heart, a philosophical and scientific question. If you look at the American Revolution, in fact, since we're coming up on July 4th, what was one of the leading fights that went on during the period when they were drafting and ratifying the Declaration of Independence? 3 words: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, rather than life, liberty, and property. Property was the term that was in the North Carolina Constitution that was taken directly from John Locke. Now, John Locke is a classic example of an oligarchical thinker who believed that there were limits, who believed that there's scarcity, who believed there are limits to our knowledge. Whereas, fortunately, Benjamin Franklin was heavily influenced by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German philosopher and scientist, who was attacked by Voltaire for saying this is the best of all possible worlds in Voltaire's play Candide. But what did Leibniz mean? Why is it the best of all possible worlds? Because the physical universe can bend to man's reason, that we can make discoveries that will increase the potential of mankind to tame the universe around us for the benefit of man. And so for Leibniz, pursuit of happiness meant acting in coherence with other fellow human beings based on reason and creativity to be able to transform nature for the benefit of all, as opposed to a small group of propertied classes having titles of nobility which give them the power to dictate to all the peons and peasants. Now, this is what the fight still is today. We have a small oligarchy. You mentioned Davos, the Davos billionaires, the World Economic Forum. Their great reset is not for you and me. It's to make sure that the billionaires keep their billions and, in fact, increase them, while the rest of us are left squabbling over a slightly bigger piece of a shrinking pie. Now, there's no reason, as you just pointed out, and this is one of the core aspects of LaRouche's philosophy, there are no limits to growth. Now, it doesn't mean that you build parking lots all over the earth. It means you build in a way that's in harmony with both man and nature. And that's the idea, which is the guiding principle of natural law in our Constitution, that if you give people options to make decisions based on reason, as opposed to momentary sense of urgency or desires, but of what do we need 50 years from now? What do we need 25 years from now? That's how Franklin and Hamilton, and Jefferson was under Franklin's influence at that period, came up with the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. So if we're going to celebrate that on July 4th, people should read the Declaration of Independence. And if you can, get a hold of there's several books on the debates at the constitutional, or the period of the Miracle of 76, I think it's called, is one of the Miracle in Philadelphia, where you find that there were these powerful debates. And then later on, when Hamilton wrote the Federalist Papers with Madison and Jay. Yeah. These led to barroom brawls. People were reading these and arguing. Instead of arguing Michael Jordan or LeBron, they were discussing Plato versus Aristotle. Do we have unlimited potential based on creativity, or do we live in a fixed finite universe? That was what people were focused on at that time. And I think we need an element of that kind of philosophical thinking, not in the academies, but in the streets, in the political discussions. We need leaders who really believe in statecraft as the most beautiful of all endeavors of man, because we're creating the potential for man's creativity to improve the future for all mankind. So that's what we should celebrate on July 4th. And if you have a hot dog and a beer with it, that's fine. But hopefully people will take a look at the Declaration of Independence and really reflect on how we have the freedoms that we're squandering right now. What enabled us to build a nation that we're losing.
Amen to that. What? I think I'll read it. I think I will read the thing, even with all of the diatribes about the king and everything. It seems a little dated in a way, but the essence of it is the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of happiness as a part of creation, as a member of this amazing thing called life.
And self-government, John, the idea that reason among men can serve as the basis for organizing a government. Because the hackneyed belief today is that government is itself the evil. No, it's who runs the government for what purposes. If you give the government into the hands of the corporate cartels, don't be surprised if they pick your pockets while they're quoting Adam Smith and free market theory. The invisible hand of Adam Smith is the one that's in your wallet. The idea of government should be a high ideal where people serve with the idea of leaving a legacy to the future of goodness, of the common interests of all. And we've lost that. We've lost it because of the power of money. We've lost it because of the bad education. We've lost it because of all sorts of things. And it's being made worse by people who are polarizing each against all. When you talk about the British system, it's the Darwinian view of law of the jungle, each against all. That actually goes back to Thomas Hobbes, who, along with Locke, to me, are two of the worst examples of British political philosophy. But Hobbes, basically man is a beast. You need government to curb the bestial instincts. No, man is not a beast. We can be beastly, but we don't have to be. I mean, we lived for many, many millennia without having significant growth of the population. And then we had a series of developments, some of which were around the ancient Greeks, Plato and others, then from early Christianity, and then most importantly from the 14th century, getting out of the new dark ages of the bubonic plague and creating a renaissance based on science and philosophy, where you had a few leaders like the Medicis, for example, who with all their graft and corruption, nevertheless used some of that to create magnificent buildings and libraries so that people could study the works of Plato. And it's in this context that you had the modern nation state emerge, partly due to the work of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, the philosophers and scientists like Kepler and Leibniz, who fought for this idea of man in the image of God being creative. I mean, if we're in the image of God, what does it mean? There's no physical image. It's that we have a creative power to discover the laws of the universe and apply those to improve the conditions of our fellow man. So that's what LaRouche was involved in pounding into our thick skulls back when we were anti-war activists who weren't quite sure what to do. Suppose the war ended, then what? Well, then we had Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who just created another whole series of wars. So we've got a lot of work cut out for us. But I think if we do go back to the spirit of 76, it will help guide the movement that we're trying to create that's bigger than one figure. It's not just Donald Trump. It's a movement of reviving the spirit and philosophy of the American system.
Yeah, no, it's not about Donald Trump. Unfortunately, Donald Trump is the only person that has the visibility to lead such a movement right now. Nobody else really comes to mind that could possibly prevail in trying to bring America back to, I hate to say it, but make America great again. How else could it be done right now? If you look at practical options during my lifetime, I think that's the only reasonable way that I see. But this whole philosophy of from Hobbes, declaring that the life of most men is poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
Well, that's the way they want it. They want us to be poor, nasty, brutish, and have short lives.
And pit people against each other. That's what identity politics is. Again, one thing you can say for Trump is that part of his message is that as Americans, we should have a mission, a national mission. We may disagree how to get there, but we should fight as a people with a purpose and a mission, as opposed to getting a bigger piece of a shrinking pie for my people, for my gender, for my ethnicity, for my religion. That's how the British play this game of divide and conquer.
And I think that they're in the middle of making a move against the average white person, especially in the South. It seems to me that the whole Southern strategy from Nixon to now, the Southern strategy is a political term which refers to the idea of the Republican Party becoming racist again and taking the votes away from the Democrats by being more racist than the Dixiecrats. And that's my cynical way of putting it. But, we had Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond and others that provide.
The Democratic Party was the party of slavery.
Yeah.
Remember, Lincoln and the Republicans were the party that revived the American system. It was under Lincoln where you had a revival of Hamiltonian economic policy, what's called the American system, through a man named Henry Carey. Henry Carey was a great economist and philosopher who worked with Lincoln. His father was Matthew Carey, who was the publisher of Ben Franklin's works. So you had a direct connection, lineage from Franklin to Lincoln. And the Whig Party, which grew up in opposition to slavery in the 40s and 1840s and 50s, became the Republican Party as a party of free men, free soil, and development. And it remained so literally until World War I, when you had a significant shift with actually it was in during the Depression, where Franklin Roosevelt broke with the Democratic Party as the Dixie Party, even though there were many Dixiecrats who were still Democrats. So we're still living with this fight that goes back to the Civil War. But where did that come from? The Civil War was a British operation to divide our country. And the British tried to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy because the British wanted the United States to be producing raw materials that would be shipped to Britain to be turned into products. That was the whole relationship between the British and the Confederacy, and also the traders in the North among the Boston Brahmin, who were part of the British system, the Cabots and the Lodges and those people. So Lincoln rallied the country around this idea of a republic. And you had other people. McKinley was another greatly underestimated figure. McKinley put through tariff policies that completely drove the British crazy, and they ended up assassinating him and replacing him with an Anglophile named Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. And that just, when you say the British assassinated McKinley, I have no problem with that. I can blow right past that. Say, yeah, you're right. But the history books won't tell you that. That's
Well, the
one of our
person
big
who pulled the
problems.
trigger came from the Fabian Society networks in the United States.
I didn't know he was with the Fabian Society networks, because that has been such a focus of mine in the past 3 or 4 months, is just really looking into this Fabian Society. And I guess you're familiar with the Fabian window at the London School of Economics. Uh,
Sure.
that window there shows that the London School of Economics itself is an agent of the Fabians.
Oh,
And
sure.
we think of it as the greatest economic institution for education in the world. I mean, I remember I knew a guy that went there, and I remember thinking to myself, what a interesting idea to go to London and study economics. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity. But here you have that window in which the Fabian guy with the hammer over his head is going to smash the world and reshape it into their idea of what a good world should look like. And it's just,
John, the London School of Economics was essentially a Rothschild operation that was deployed into the United States to defeat William McKinley in 1896, because they knew McKinley was pushing for a tariff. One of the things they did to try to defeat McKinley was set up an outpost at the University of Chicago, the Chicago School, which to this day, people like Leo Strauss and Milton Friedman are associated with the Chicago School. It's a British Fabian society, the right-wing side of the Fabians, the free market, and so on. But the London School of Economics, and then you pair that with Oxford and the Rhodes Scholarship, and you see the way the British have been manipulating both so-called tendencies, left and right, controlling them both. You have Keynes and Friedman, supposedly enemies. Actually, they were friends, and they shared what? A view that it's monetary policy, which is what economics is about. The American system is based on the idea of physical productivity, physical production, transforming nature, and having a financial system which creates the resources, the credit that can be used to do that, knowing that if you create credit that goes into future technologies, you'll ultimately increase the productivity so that you can pay down the debt. The idea today that's hegemonic in both parties is debt is bad. We can't go into debt. And then what do? They go into huge debt. For what? Bailing out banks and fighting wars. Now, that's non-productive debt. That's the kind of debt that destroys a nation. But Hamilton said a well-managed national debt is a national blessing. And he said, as a codicil to that, never take on a debt without the means to extinguish it. You don't extinguish a debt by war fighting unless you plan on looting the people you defeat. You don't extinguish a debt by creating speculative bubbles. So the way you cover debt is by increasing the productivity of your workforce through scientific advance and then the technological innovation that comes from applying the new science. That's what Hamilton was about. That's what Lincoln was about. That's the American system. And Trump had some inkling of that. And he had an inkling of it partly through relationship with his uncle, who was a prominent scientist, was in fact involved in I believe, the Manhattan Project in Tennessee during the war. That's also, by the way, why Trump doesn't like nuclear weapons. His uncle was a avowed opponent of the use of nuclear weapons in war. So you look at this difference between the American system and what's the British system? Adam Smith, buy cheap, sell dear. Get the cheapest labor, cheapest raw materials, and then the highest markup you can get. That's the difference between the British system and the American system, and the morality difference is clear. The morality of a system of productivity that prizes labor and the advances in thinking that enable you to increase the wealth, as opposed to how can you swindle someone to make a profit. That's the difference.
The word rentier comes to mind, rentier,
Yeah.
a word that's often described to use used to describe the British aristocrats, especially the very wealthy Scots and English, that got wealthy on the slave and opium trade, and now consider themselves to be far beyond the idea of actual work or physical work, but basically to manipulate their money in such a way that they have a constant stream of income that keeps them at this incredibly high lifestyle, and they have castles and all of these great servants and everything, Downton Abbey all over the place, and they force that on everybody. That society has to have two parts: the rulers. This is Bertrand Russell. The ruling class. We are the rulers, and the rest of them, we're going to get the real education. We're going to learn how science really works, and we're going to understand, if some new breakthrough comes through, that we're going to benefit from them, not them. And the rest of the people are the serfs, or the laborers, the ones that do the labor. And that God made them to be laborers. Why shouldn't we use their labor if God made these serfs out there, and there are all so many of them? Matter of fact, there's too many of them, and we also need to take care of culling the population of these serfs from time to time. So
That's
what?
Malthus. That's Parson Malthus and the Malthusian policy.
And that's what they're doing. And
Yeah.
biological warfare, I think, is got to be part of our discussion at some point. Where look at what the British did with smallpox. They come up with a smallpox vaccine. They vaccinate their soldiers, and then they throw the smallpox blankets and infected prostitutes at the enemy. And that's how the British waged war from way back in the 1700s. So are they not doing the same type of thing now when you have these Nazi biological warfare programs going on, where they develop an extraordinarily lethal virus, but also develop at the same time a VA. I can't say that word or I'll get struck, but the VA word, the VAC word, and it's a sword and shield type of thing, where we say, we've got this sword, but we've also got the shield, so we can use the
But
sword.
John, there's
Shield.
there's another part of this which actually is more direct from the British.
Yeah.
Which Malthus wrote a paper one time where he said we shouldn't conduct public improvements like cleaning up a swamp, because we should allow the disease to naturally spread to those who live near the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the International Monetary Fund policy, going back to the 60s and 70s, Lyndon LaRouche made a forecast in 1975 where he said if the IMF is not abolished, their policies will lead to the spread of pandemic disease, because they will not allow nations to develop clean water, decent housing, electricity, modern infrastructure. And it's modern platforms of infrastructure which enabled the human race to extend its life expectancy from 30 to 40 years up to 75 to 80 years or even higher. And what are we looking at today? Life expectancy is dropping in the United States. It's partly the drug policy, which is, you demoralize a population and you pump in drugs and people will kill themselves. But it's also, if you don't take care of the elderly and the sick, and Obamacare was an insurance policy swindle. It was not a health care program. Most of the world has almost no health care. And so, before COVID, this was something that was waiting to happen as a population reduction policy. And I think that's where when you look at Malthusianism, that's why Mrs. LaRouche is saying we need a world-class health capability in every nation as part of economic development, because that's what infrastructure is. It includes electricity, water, highways, hospitals, schools, and so on.
Absolutely. I agree completely. I think the question of whether a extraordinarily virulent disease is caused by an intention or by accident is not nearly as important as how we respond to it.
That's right.
And if we're not able to respond to it with proper health measures, then we're going to have a pandemic. But if
And
we
commitment to save lives. I mean, it's
yeah,
interesting. You know, people can say what they want about China, but the Chinese built new hospitals in 5 days. They did everything they could to protect the lives of the people who were getting sick. You know, in the West, we had this attitude that, oh, well, that's over there, until it was too late. And, you know, I think the lesson from this thing has to be that you have to have an understanding of full infrastructure as the basis of an economic policy. And, you know, what we're doing, this debate on infrastructure in the United States, it's not about infrastructure. It's about windmills and solar panels and make work jobs. It's part of the Davos plan to impoverish the advanced sector, to equalize the whole world as you say, peons and serfs, that the small few at the top can benefit from.
it's like I don't know, like maybe like an Oreo cookie or something. There's all this wealth at the top, and there's all this poverty at the bottom, and the creamy white stuff in the middle. I don't mean to colorize it, but the stuff in the middle is the American population as coming out of World War II, where we had the best standard of living, the most sound economy, the greatest industrial strength, the infrastructure. We were all set to build highways everywhere, and the growth of this country was seen as completely unstoppable. And these people, but it was all supported by the stuff in the middle. The middle class is what.
And a growing middle class, you know, a thicker and thicker Oreo cookie.
Yeah, yeah, and as that grew, the ones on the top said, you know what, I got a better idea. Instead of allowing the middle class to grow, let's get rid of the middle class and make a bigger lower class, and that way the middle class will never ever threaten us. And so by getting rid of that middle class, they ensure their permanent hegemony over all the serfs and peons. But what happens to us is that instead of raising the rest of the world to our standard of living, which is what President Kennedy would have done, they're lowering our standard of living to the lowest common denominator of the rest of the world.
Well, and one other aspect of this, John, was the whole move toward free trade. Now, the free trading systems of globalization, which essentially said we can let other people for less wages, less concern with the environment and everything else, produce the goods for us and shut down our factories, shut down our industries, deindustrialize the country. And that depended on the ability to have other governments around the world willing to do that. The Chinese did it for a while, but at a certain point they said, okay, if we don't raise living standards in China, if we don't increase wages and other benefits, we're going to have a social revolution. So let's do that. And so the profits were starting to get shaved from China. And all of a sudden, China went from being the golden calf to being a potential adversary. And you know, it's not just China. Most of the world rejects the idea of the Green Revolution and the Great Reset. We in the United States, most Americans don't like them either. But we don't understand that Russia and China and India and possibly Japan and Germany could be our allies against this British parasitical system. And that's our job. We've got to educate people to understand that. And that's the I think the greatest contribution from Lyndon LaRouche was this concept of human nature from the standpoint of being a uniquely creative force in the universe, as opposed to the idea of useless eaters, and that's the battle line.
I was talking to your colleague Daniel Burke, who is out there on the streets in New York City.
Yeah.
Looks like at least once a week. He's very dedicated to go out there and just talk to the people. And what I think um, that is what has to be done, is to engage just people. You know, it seems like a hopeless thing to stand out in a city square with a poster and say, you know, talk to me. I want to talk about this stuff. But
John, that's what I did for many years when in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta,
ah,
was to build up a movement based on engaging people. And so while I'm not in the streets today, although occasionally I go out, but I do that through radio interviews, through daily updates, with the idea that I'm talking to people who are capable of being creative and want a better world, and try to imbue them with the optimism that we have the instruments of self-government that can enable us to do that. That's what organizing is. And that you do the same thing by making people aware of what it is that's oppressing them, and not just to get them to say, oh yeah, now that I know, I'm going to give up. No, we have to fight.
well, thanks, Harley. We fight. We fight in our own ways. I see in our chat room today Norman Smith, who's become a friend of mine. He's a musician, and he's somebody that lives from the heart. He'll tell you, he'll give you the shirt off his back, and his heart's on his sleeve, and he's going to be real with you, and absolutely dedicated to the good side of humanity. And I just saw that he's struggling with his dog. He's maybe having some serious health problems, and it's sad. It's depressing when we lose our pets. Or, you know, what can you do for an old pet that you know has stood by you for his whole life, and you want to do something for but there's gonna come a time when you're gonna lose that pet, and it's a sad time. I'm afraid Norman might be facing that now, so I just wanted to give a shout out to Norman on the show here. And
But you know, you keep the memories. In that sense, the cat or the dog lives on in your memory, and your empathy for that animal, which may not seem like much, nevertheless is a human quality that we can get from pets. I have a crazy little dog that you know, drives us all crazy, but he's so loyal. You got to love him.
Yeah, we do. And I love the point about empathy that you just made, because it's the growth of empathy that makes a strong country. You know, I don't know if you know the song American Anthem by Gene Shear. It was the theme song to Ken Burns' series on on World War II. And so you
Yeah.
heard Nora Jones perform that song. And, you know, I've performed it myself quite a few times. It's all about, you know, from what we were given, we're determined to leave more.
Yeah.
You know, I was given so many gifts. You know, my parents, my neighborhood, my school, my friends, my teachers, my church, you know, all the gifts that I've been given. You know, what good are they if I don't pass them on?
Exactly.
And that's what we're trying to do here, is to share the human experience. You know, and to keep hope alive that we're going to continue to be human in the future, that we're not going to transform into some hybrid robot thing that just does what the controllers say. And boy, the more I read about Bertrand Russell, the more I realize they're quite serious about reducing us to robotic servants, and take away our ability to reason, and especially to take away our God-given empathy.
Well, John, I appreciate those sentiments because I agree with them completely. And again, to your viewers and listeners, if anyone wants to be in touch with me, to read what I'm writing each week, to see my daily updates, send me an email, or just to engage in conversation. Send me an email at harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll be sure to answer you. I can send you a link to my blog page, and look forward to hearing from you.
Excellent. Well, something to look forward to tomorrow. I will have the great Doug Valentine as my guest, 11:30 a.m. East Coast time, and Doug's going to give us his presentation that would have been given on June 6th for my father's Memorial Day, as Harley has given us a terrific presentation. So That's tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Here on whichever McDuff channel is up. It'll either be McDuff Lives or McDuff Lives 2. Just wanted to get that program note out because I know so many people are devoted to Doug Valentine, and I'm just so delighted that he's taken an active part in not only in the research and writing of my book, but in helping us to get the word out generally about the real truth behind our military-industrial complex and the history that my father lived through. All right, Harley Schlanger, once again, it's been a terrific pleasure for me, and I certainly did get a lot out of it today. Thanks, Harley.
See you in a couple of weeks.
All right, see you in 2 weeks. Bye now.
Okay, John.